black sails on the Nile, warriors carved into limestone, feathered headdresses and horned helmets, frozen forever mid-battle on a temple wall in southern Egypt. 3,000 years ago, these people brought down the most connected world that had ever existed. The Hittite Empire, gone. Mycenaean Greece, burned to the ground. Ugarit, reduced to ash while its final letters were still hardening in the kiln. Within a single generation, almost all of it was over. History gave the force behind it a name: the Sea Peoples. But a name is not an explanation. For 3,000 years, they were faces without origins, warriors without biology, a roster of strangers who appeared from the water and then disappeared from the record entirely. Where they came from and where they went, no one could say. Then the science finally arrived, and the truth was stranger than vanishing. They never actually disappeared at all. To understand what the Sea Peoples brought down, you first have to understand what existed. And what existed by the middle of the second millennium before Christ was something the world had never seen before. Picture a trading ship, 50 feet long, moving through the eastern Mediterranean. In its hold, copper ingots from Cyprus, amber from the distant Baltic coast, ivory out of Africa, pottery from Greece, grain from Egypt, and tin, the rarest prize of all, a single vessel carrying the material output of half the known world. We know this ship existed because divers pulled it from the seabed off the coast of southwestern Turkey in 1982. The Uluburun wreck dated to around 1320 before Christ, its cargo a snapshot of an entire age. The tin alone tells the story. Isotope analysis traced it across thousands of miles to the mountains of Central Asia and the highlands of Anatolia, though exactly which mines remains debated to this day. What is not debated is the reach. Someone was moving metal across continents to keep this world armed. Because that ship was not an accident. It was a symbol. By the 14th and 13th centuries before Christ, the great powers of the region had built something genuinely unprecedented: a system. Egypt in the southwest, the Hittite Empire holding Anatolia, Mycenaean Greece to the northwest, Babylon and Assyria anchoring the east, and smaller, wealthy kingdoms like Ugarit threading the connections between them. These powers traded with each other, they wrote to each other, they married into each other. We know this because the correspondence survived. More than 300 clay tablets, discovered at Amarna in Egypt, preserve the actual diplomatic letters of the age. Great kings addressing one another as brothers, negotiating gold, complaining when a shipment arrived short. And the language they wrote in was Babylonian, not because Babylon ruled the rest, but because centuries of contact had produced a common tongue all of them could share. That detail alone tells you how deeply connected this world had become. What held it together by force was the chariot. Fast, expensive, devastating on open ground, the chariot was the tank of the Bronze Age. But it was also a luxury only a wealthy state could afford. You needed skilled craftsmen to build it, trained horses to pull it, professional warriors to drive it, and a surplus economy to pay for all three. The chariot encoded power into a machine only the great kingdoms could possess. And that was precisely the weakness hidden inside the strength, because the bronze that armed those chariots required tin, and the tin came from the far edges of the map. Remove a few links in that chain, and the flow slowed. Remove several at once, and the whole architecture of exchange began to buckle. This was a world of breathtaking sophistication built on supply lines stretched impossibly thin. And by the late 13th century, the reports coming in were turning dark. Famine gripping the Hittite highlands, the palaces of Greece suddenly raising new walls, the archaeology of people who have begun to feel afraid, and a letter from the king of Ugarit carrying a warning. The ships of the enemy, he wrote, have been seen. Then, around the year 1177 before Christ, the ships arrived. A fleet appeared at the mouth of the Nile, moving into the delta, and the warriors aboard struck the Egyptians as genuinely foreign. Some wore feathered headdresses, others wore horned helmets. Their armor mixed heavy plate with light leather. Their weapons were built around long slashing swords and javelins, rather than the bows and spears that had defined warfare in this world for centuries. This was not a uniformed army serving a single king. It was something harder to name. A confederation. A coalition of different peoples moving together with a shared purpose, even as their origins scattered across half the Mediterranean. The pharaoh who met them was Ramesses the Third, and according to Ramesses the Third, he won. This is exactly where the historian's instinct has to sharpen. Pharaohs never lost. The inscriptions carved into the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu describe a total and glorious Egyptian victory, in the same language Egyptian propaganda had used for 1,000 years. The enemy crushed, the pharaoh triumphant, the gods satisfied. What makes the account unusual is not the boasting. It is the sheer scale of the threat it feels compelled to describe. No land, the inscription says, had been able to stand before these invaders. They had already torn through Hadi, through Carchemish, through Arzawa, through Al-Ashia, a trail of ruin that matches the archaeological record of collapsed cities across the entire eastern Mediterranean, ending at Egypt's door. A pharaoh who was genuinely winning did not need to explain quite so carefully how dangerous his enemy had been. The names carved into those reliefs have occupied scholars ever since. The Peliset, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh. 5 peoples named in the 1177 account, part of a larger roster of 9 or 10 groups that surface across Egyptian sources spanning decades, because this was never a single event. That detail is critical, and it is constantly overlooked. The attack on Ramesses the Third was the second major invasion attempt within 30 years. Around 1207 before Christ, his predecessor Merneptah had already turned back a combined force of Libyans and sea raiders on the western approaches to the delta. The sea peoples were not an eruption from nowhere. They were a pressure that had been building for generations, appearing in the records first as pirates, then as mercenaries, then as raiders, and finally as something that looked uncomfortably like a migration in force. And the reliefs at Medinet Habu preserve one detail that carries enormous weight. Alongside the warships and the fighting men, the carvings show ox carts, loaded with women, children, and household possessions. These were not purely raiding parties looking for plunder and a fast escape. At least some of these people were moving, bringing everything they owned, looking for somewhere to land and stay. But here's the blind spot at the center of all of it. Every word we have comes from Egypt. The sea peoples themselves left no inscriptions, no letters, no account of who they were or what drove them. Everything passed through the perspective of the one power that managed to resist them, which left 2 questions hanging over the ruins for 3,000 years. Who were they, and where did they go? The name itself is younger than you might think. For all its weight, the phrase sea peoples was not carved by any pharaoh. It was coined in 1855 by a French Egyptologist named Emmanuel de Rougé, looking at the warriors depicted at Medinet Habu and reaching for a way to describe them. His successor, Gaston Maspero, popularized the term and bolted it onto the migration theories fashionable in his century, connecting these peoples to the movements of early Europe in ways that said far more about the 19th century than the 12th before Christ. The label stuck. The certainty behind it never quite arrived, because for the better part of 200 years, scholars circled the same wall. 9 or 10 named groups, wildly different appearances in the carvings, no written records left by the sea peoples themselves, and almost no biological evidence of any kind. What the field was left with for most of that time was pottery and helmet shapes, and pottery and helmet shapes can only carry you so far. Consider the candidates, and notice that every one of them is a plausible argument rather than a proven fact. The Shurden are perhaps the most striking, shown with horned helmets and round shields, and long linked to Sardinia. The connection has real weight behind it. The neuralgic culture of Bronze Age Sardinia produced bronze figurines that bear a remarkable resemblance to the warriors carved in Egypt. And Shurden fighters appear in Egyptian records long before 1177, serving as mercenaries, even guarding the body of Ramesses II, a relationship with Egypt stretching across centuries, swinging between service and hostility. The Luca are placed more firmly. We know almost certainly where Luca was. It is Lycia, in the far southwest of modern Turkey, a region with a long and documented history of maritime raiding that predates the collapse by centuries. Luca ships appear in the Amarna letters, in Hittite records, and in the desperate final correspondence of Ugarit. These were not newcomers to the business of violence at sea. The Peliset present the strongest case of all. The argument that they became the Philistines, settling the southern coast of the Levant in the years right after the collapse, is supported by archaeology at the cities they are said to have founded. Distinctive pottery, changed food practices, new building styles, all of it carrying clear Aegean connections, all of it pointing toward an incoming population rather than simple continuity with what came before. And then there are the Eqesh, more contentious and more tantalizing than any of them. The similarity of the name to the Achaeans of Homer, the Greeks of the Iliad, has been noted for generations. Mycenaean warriors are depicted in foreign armies long before the collapse, familiar faces in the military labor market of the Bronze Age. Whether the Eqesh were displaced Mycenaeans, opportunistic raiders, or something more complicated still remains genuinely unresolved. That unresolved quality runs through everything. Without biological evidence, each identification was ultimately an educated guess, compelling in places, frustratingly circumstantial everywhere else. The objects could hint, but they could not testify. To answer the question properly, the field would need the people themselves. But before biology could speak, an even larger question demanded an answer first. What had pushed an entire world to the breaking point to begin with? For a long time, the instinct was simple. The sea peoples were the explanation. A force arrives, civilizations fall, the case is closed. It is a clean story. And it is almost certainly wrong, or at least dramatically incomplete. The more carefully the evidence has been examined, the clearer it becomes that the collapse was not a single blow struck by a single enemy. It was a cascade, a system failure, with crises arriving faster than any one of them could be answered. Start with the climate. In recent decades, the study of ancient pollen has added something to this debate that no amount of pottery ever could. Samples drawn from lake beds across the eastern Mediterranean tell a consistent story. Beginning around 1200 before Christ, the region entered a long and severe drought. Rainfall dropped across vast areas. Ground that had fed dense populations for centuries began turning to dust. For highland kingdoms like the Hittites, already hard to feed in good years and dependent on grain shipped in from Egypt, sustained crop failure was not an inconvenience. It was existential. Then there are the earthquakes. Analysis of the 12th century before Christ reveals a remarkable clustering of major seismic events across Greece, Anatolia, Syria, and the Levant. Destruction layers at site after site match the signature of earthquake damage rather than deliberate burning. And it is worth noting that Egypt sat outside the worst of that seismic zone, which may go some way toward explaining why Egypt, alone among the great powers, survived the storm weakened but intact while everything around it fell. Then the supply lines. Bronze Age power was made quite literally of bronze, and bronze required tin, and the tin came from the far edges of the world. When the long overland routes that carried it were disrupted, the consequences rippled through every army and every palace economy that depended on it. Iron existed as an alternative, but smelting it demanded far higher temperatures, which made it difficult and at first rare. The shift to iron that followed was not a choice, it was an adaptation to scarcity. And once mastered, iron became the great leveler because it could be found almost anywhere, which meant the metal monopoly that had kept the palaces powerful was simply gone. And then the most unsettling piece of all. At several sites, the destruction is strangely specific. The palace structures burned. The settlements around them did not. That is not the signature of an outside invader sweeping through everything in its path. That is the signature of people who knew exactly what they wanted to destroy. Populations who had supported these palace economies through generations of taxation and conscription, now watching those same economies fail to protect them from famine and earthquake and raids, may have drawn their own conclusions about where the real problem lay. What all of this produces is a picture in which the sea peoples were as much symptom as cause. People already uprooted by drought, or freed from collapsed authority, or pulled into a vacuum left by the simultaneous failure of every stabilizing force in the region. Wolves, certainly, but wolves circling a wounded animal, not a healthy one. The world they attacked was already tearing itself apart, which leaves the question everything has been building toward: what became of them? For most of human history, the dead kept their origins secret. Whatever journeys a person had made, whatever distances their ancestors had crossed, whatever populations they descended from, all of it vanished with them into the ground. The objects survived. The bodies stayed silent. And so the question of who the sea peoples were sat unanswerable, locked inside bones no one could yet read. Then ancient DNA changed everything. Scientists learned to extract and sequence genetic material from skeletons thousands of years old, drawing it from teeth and from the dense bone of the inner ear, where biological information survives longest. Suddenly, the past began speaking in an entirely new language, not the language of pottery and helmet shapes, but the language of biology itself. And when that language was finally turned on the sea peoples, it did not produce a single clean answer. It produced something more interesting. The most important study focused on the group with the strongest case of all, the Philistines. In 2019, a team led by Michael Feldman and Daniel Master, working with the geneticist Johannes Krauss at the Max Planck Institute alongside the Leon Levy expedition, published their findings in the journal Science Advances. They had recovered genome-wide data from 10 individuals buried at Ashkelon, one of the core Philistine cities, across 3 different windows of time: the Late Bronze Age, before the collapse; the Early Iron Age, when Philistine culture suddenly appears; and the Later Iron Age, generations after. What they found in those early Iron Age burials was a clear signal of European ancestry. Ancestry that was simply absent in the local population that had occupied the same ground in the centuries before. This was not a faint statistical trace. In some individuals, it accounted for as much as 1/4 to 2/3 of their genome. A genuine discontinuity, marking the arrival of people from somewhere else. And the closest matches did not point inward toward the Levant. They pointed across the sea, toward southern Europe and the Aegean, toward Crete, Sardinia, Iberia. Not a single pinpointed homeland, but a direction. And it was the same direction the pottery had been pointing all along. That was the breakthrough. For the first time, the archaeology and the genetics were saying the same thing at once. The Aegean-style vessels, the changed food practices, the new architecture, and now the blood itself, all converging on a migration across the Mediterranean. But honesty matters here, and good science states its limits plainly. 10 individuals is a small sample on which to rest the story of an entire people. The DNA can record that a migration happened, but it cannot confirm that these specific individuals were the sea peoples named on Egyptian walls. The researchers themselves were careful to say so. They had found a movement of people crossing the Mediterranean at exactly the right moment. They had not proven that movement carried the name carved at Medinet Habu. The signal is real. The label remains an interpretation. And yet the finding does something the old mystery could never survive. It puts living, traceable human beings at the center of a story that had been faceless for 3,000 years. Which raises the final question, the one detail that answers the title. What happened to that European signal in the generations that came next? Here is the answer the old mystery never allowed for. Within 2 or 3 generations, the European signal that had marked those earliest Philistine burials begins to fade. By the later Iron Age layers at Ashkelon, it has blended substantially into the surrounding population. The newcomers did not remain a separate people sealed off from the world around them. They arrived, they settled, they married into the local population, and within a few generations, their descendants were genetically indistinguishable from the wider region. The boundary dissolved, and that is the real reason the Sea Peoples vanished. They were never destroyed. They were never driven into the sea or wiped from the earth. They were absorbed. The thing that made them visible, that distinct genetic signature carried across the Mediterranean, simply dissolved into the gene pool of the coast they had landed on. They did not disappear. They merged. But notice what outlasted the biology: the culture. Long after the European ancestry had faded from the bones, the Philistine cities kept an unmistakable fingerprint. At Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza, the earliest layers carry Aegean-style pottery, distinct from anything made in the region before. Food practices changed, with pork appearing in the record where it had not belonged before. Architecture shifted. An incoming people had planted itself, drawing on origins carried across the sea while absorbing the land it had settled into. And the name outlasted everything. These were the Philistines who entered one of the most widely read texts in human history, remembered as the great rivals of early Israel, the people of the giant Goliath. Whatever their scattered origins in the chaos of the collapse, they achieved a kind of immortality in memory that almost none of their fellow sea peoples managed. Their name has outlived their cities, their language, and their biology. Others followed quieter paths. The Shurden, those horned helmet warriors, turn up serving in Egyptian armies for centuries after the collapse. Some settled in Egypt itself with land grants and standing, their relationship with the state evolving from threat to integration. It is not so different from the Germanic soldiers who would one day serve Rome, rising to influence inside the very system their ancestors had raided. And Cyprus, sitting at the crossroads of the whole Mediterranean, became a kind of melting pot, a refuge where displaced peoples who had lost their kingdoms and their trade routes converged and forged new identities out of the wreckage of the old ones. The deepest trace of all is still with us. The European ancestry those early settlers carried into the Levant never fully vanished. Diluted across generation after generation of intermarriage, it remains faintly detectable in the regional gene pool to this day. The people living on that coast now carry, somewhere in the layered record of their ancestry, a biological thread reaching back across the sea to the Bronze Age world, whose collapse deposited their ancestors on that shore. That is what the science finally revealed. The Sea Peoples set out to find a world to enter. They found one. They became part of it. The question was never really where they went, because they never truly left. They are still here, written into the bodies of the people who live where they once landed. Those carved reliefs at Medinet Habu are still there. Warriors in feathered headdresses and horned helmets, frozen in limestone, locked in a battle on the Nile, presiding over a victory that could not stop the slow collapse of everything behind it. For 3,000 years, they stood without names, without origins, without biology. The science did not solve everything. The Sea Peoples remain plural, elusive, resistant to a single clean answer. But it did the more important thing. It gave them back their humanity. These were real people, fleeing real disasters, crossing a real sea to find new families on a new shore. The Bronze Age world was not ended by aliens arriving from nowhere. It was ended from within, by the same desperate, ambitious humanity that had built it. They destroyed a world, they survived it, and in the most literal sense, they became us. Subscribe and turn on notifications.